Have you ever just looked around and wondered how nature balances its books? You know, how a couple of rabbits can suddenly turn into a whole field full of them? Or why some species seem to be everywhere while others just disappear? Well, it all boils down to the basic math of life: population growth. So let's jump right in and figure out the rules of this incredible numbers game.
This right here is the big question we're tackling. And the answer isn't just one simple thing. Nope, it's a really fascinating dance between birth rates, death rates, and what the environment itself can actually handle. Let's start to unpack how it all fits together.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the absolute basics, the simple math of population change. Then we'll look at what growth would look like in a perfect world with no limits. After that, we'll get real and see what happens when you add limited resources into the mix. We'll wrap things up by looking at some of evolution's clever strategies and do a quick recap of the key formulas.
All right, to really get a grip on the big picture, we've got to start with the 4 fundamental forces that control any population. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about microbes in a lab or wolves in a national park, these 4 things are always at play.
Okay, I love this because it makes a complex idea super simple. Just think of a population size, we're going to call that N, as the water level in a bathtub. You've got 2 things filling it up: natality, which is just a fancy word for births, and immigration, which is new individuals moving in. That's your faucet. Then you've got 2 things draining the water: mortality, or deaths, and emigration, which is individuals leaving. That's your drain. It's the constant push and pull between that faucet and that drain that decides everything.
And here's how you write that bathtub idea as a simple formula. The population in the future, let's call it n at time t plus 1, is just the population you have right now, n at time t, plus all the additions from births and immigration, minus all the subtractions from deaths and emigration. You see, it's just what you start with, plus the n's, minus the outs. So simple, but so powerful.
Okay, so let's take that basic idea and build on it. For our first model, I want you to imagine a kind of paradise. A place with endless food, unlimited space, and absolutely no predators. What do you think would happen to a population in a place like that?
Well, that perfect imaginary scenario is what we call exponential growth. It's what happens when a species can just go for it, realizing its absolute maximum potential to reproduce without anything getting in the way. This is growth with the pedal to the metal. Now, to measure that potential, scientists use a special value they call R, the intrinsic rate of natural increase. But don't let the name scare you. Just think of it like this. It's the birth rate per individual minus the death rate per individual. That's it. If R is positive, the population grows. If it's negative, it shrinks. It's the number that tells you how fast a species could grow if nothing held it back.
And if we look at some real-world examples, you can see R is totally different from species to species. Look at the flower beetle. Its R is 0.12. That's way higher than the Norway rat at 0.015. So the beetle has a much higher potential for explosive growth. This R value is like a key part of a species' signature strategy for life.
The formula for this kind of growth looks simple. dn dt equals R times n. That dn dt part just means the change in population over time. So let's make it real. Say you've got 1,000 Norway rats, that's our n, and we know their R value is 0.015. You just multiply those 2 numbers. 1,000 times 0.015 is 15, so the population grows by 15 rats. But here's the kicker. Next time you start with 1,015 rats, and the growth is calculated on that bigger number. And that's the engine of exponential growth. It just keeps feeding on itself and getting faster and faster.
And when you graph that accelerating growth, you get this classic shape, the J-curve. You see how it starts off slow, almost flat, but as the population base gets bigger, the rate of growth just skyrockets, sending that curve almost straight up. This is the visual fingerprint of unchecked exponential growth.
If you want to feel how powerful this is, think about that old story about the king and the chessboard. The minister just asked for 1 grain of wheat on the first square, 2 on the next, 4 after that, just doubling each time. The king thinks it's a bargain, but he didn't realize that doubling is exponential growth. Before he was even halfway across the board, the amount of wheat was more than his entire kingdom could possibly produce. That's the deceptive, mind-blowing power of the J-curve.
Of course, that kind of perfect paradise with unlimited wheat doesn't actually exist. So now we have to pivot. We have to move away from the ideal model and see what happens in the messy, real world where resources are always limited.
Exactly. In the real world, food eventually gets scarce, places get crowded, predators take notice. No population can keep growing exponentially forever.
Sooner or later, the environment starts to push back.
And that environmental pushback, that limit, has a name. It's called the carrying capacity, and we represent it with the letter K. Basically, K is the maximum number of individuals that a particular environment can support for the long haul. You can think of K as nature's hard ceiling.
So once we factor in this carrying capacity, our J-curve completely transforms. It becomes this much more realistic S-shaped curve. And you can see the different phases, right? It starts off slow, then it accelerates just like the J-curve for a while, but then, and this is the key part, it starts to slow down, to decelerate, and it flattens out as the population N gets closer and closer to that ceiling K.
So how do we write this with math? Well, we start with our old exponential formula, Rn, and we multiply it by this new bit, K minus N divided by K. This new piece of the puzzle is what represents the environmental resistance. It's the brakes. Think about it. When the population N is really small compared to K, that fraction is close to 1, and growth is fast. But as N gets bigger and approaches K, that fraction gets closer and closer to 0, slamming the brakes on growth.
This is a perfect way to see it all at a glance. Exponential growth, that's our theoretical model with unlimited resources, giving us that wild J-curve. Logistic growth, that's our more realistic model. It assumes resources are limited, which means the growth rate changes over time, giving us that sensible S-curve. It's really the difference between an idea in a vacuum and how things actually work out in nature.
Now, here's where it gets really cool. Faced with all these limits and pressures, life doesn't just have one game plan. Evolution has cooked up this incredible menu of different reproductive strategies, but they're all aiming for the same thing: maximizing success.
And you can see some of those different strategies right here. On one hand, you have species like Pacific salmon. They go all in, one massive reproductive event, and that's it. On the other hand, you have most mammals, who breed over and over again. Then you have the numbers game. Oysters produce millions of tiny offspring, basically playing the lottery and hoping a few survive. And then there are animals like us, or birds, that have very few large offspring, but pour a ton of energy into making sure they make it. Every single one is a different but successful answer to the puzzle of survival.
Okay, let's bring it all home. We're going to do a quick wrap-up of the two main mathematical models we've talked about, because these are really the foundation for understanding how populations work. Here they are, the heavy hitters, side by side. You've got the exponential growth formula, driven by that intrinsic rate R, which gives you the J-curve. And you've got the logistic growth formula, which adds the all-important variable K, the carrying capacity, to give us that much more realistic S-curve. These two formulas, they're the essential toolkit.
And that leaves us with one last, pretty massive question. For a very long time now, the human population has looked a lot like that J-curve. But we live on a planet with limited resources. There's a ceiling. So what does the logic of the S-curve, of a carrying capacity, tell us about the future of our own species? That's something to think about.